there. So remember our model, we've got 3 elements that feed into how we learn our role in society. And the first element is significant others. Right? So we're going to look at groups of significant others to begin with. So when we consider parents, it really depends which age group you're looking at. When we look at young children and early elementary, then parents are very important. If they are, what's a word that doesn't sound judgmental? If they're present in the child's life, right? So that doesn't just mean, you know, are they there, but how much time are they able to spend with the children? In certain parts of the country, young children are in some form of childcare for 12 hours of the day. So that means that the amount of time that the immediate family member gets with that child is relatively limited, because they wake them up, take them to childcare, go to work, maybe go to work at 2 jobs, come back later that evening, pick the child up, take them home, put them to bed. So they really don't get the time. And so sometimes in that situation, the teacher in the childcare becomes the significant other. Right? But we're hoping that in the majority of cases that's parents. And then it's, as we get older, particularly once we hit puberty and we become teenagers, really we don't care what our parents have to say. So there's a block of time there where the parents' influence is quite minimal. And then when you get into your early mid-20s, parents again become an important part of your life and start to have a little more influence. Maybe you go and ask their opinion, even if you don't follow their opinion, but you want to have their opinion to kind of balance your own as you get older. Right? So research from the 80s indicates that the gender, and I suspect they mean sex and gender of both the child and parent matters. So fathers tend to promote the gender typing that we talked about on Tuesday in their sons. And there's research that says the same-sex parent may be more influential. I have to say my family didn't really go that way, but I don't think that that's as important as the fact that the dads are a little more rigid about what they're comfortable with allowing their sons to do. So if the son comes home and says, "Oh, Dad, I want to take ballet because we had this ballet class at school and it was really fun," and the dad kind of has a hissy fit because he wants the boy to play baseball or something, right? So we see in more recent research, this is quite old, you can see in the 80s, in more recent research, we see that attitudes are starting to change, that parents are being a lot more flexible about what the children are encouraged to do or not do. And that's partly down to the fact that even though it's a very small percentage of the population, we do have more mothers that take part in sports or recreational physical activity. Right? So this is an important, this is an important idea to pay attention to, because what we find is that the best predictor of adult involvement in sport is how much they participated in sport as children and adolescents, right? So if, like, us as a population, you guys and me, you know, we're very lucky because we took part in sports and movement activities when we were young and when we were teenagers. And so that gives us a very strong foundation to maintain that habit as we get older. People who didn't have that foundation have to begin a new habit as they get older and they realize, yeah, you know what, everybody's saying I should be more physically active, and now I've got to start this new habit that I'm not very comfortable with, right? Also, the parents' bias towards exercise can have a lasting influence. You know, if they're very pro-exercise or physical activity, then that's going to be something that they will engage their children in and they'll do as a family. Okay, and that was my experience. My dad was very engaged in sport. He played rugby. And he did a lot of weight training, and so I just kind of followed along. My sister went the other way. My mum was not sedentary, but sport or movement wasn't, I mean, she liked to go for a nice walk in the woods at the weekend if the weather was good, but she didn't go out and deliberately exercise every day. She was much more keen on baking and reading, and so my sister stayed home and did baking and reading, and now my sister is overweight and has type 2 diabetes. So it's like the perfect example of what the textbook is trying to explain here. And remember, of course, that the parents have the cash, and so they're the ones who are buying the presents and the gifts and things. So we have, I know on Tuesday you weren't able to see this very much, but I love my Pottery Barn catalogue. It does all kinds of useful things for motor development. So we can see here, hopefully you can see here, let me see if I turn that way, maybe the light catches it. Here's a young lad reading in his room, but he's got a basketball there, and he's got a soccer ball down here and some other balls and things in his room, and balls of all kinds on his bedspread, right? So very, very much being encouraged or being supported in his interest in ball games, right? And here we have the girl with her dollhouse and her teddy bear and her pretend phone and not a movement toy in the whole room, right? So, that as we were talking about on Tuesday, that does play a big role. Think about if you go to Walmart, next time you go to Walmart or a big store, go to the toy aisle and just have a look at the kind of subconscious messages that are being sent out to children and to parents, right? If you look at a fire engine, right, and the fire engine is boxed up on the shelf, who is going to be on that box, do you think? Not who would we like to be on the box. Who's probably on the box for a fire engine toy? And who's probably on the box for an ironing board toy? Hey guys, you have to talk to me, otherwise I could just and run the video. Come on, please engage.
Sorry, Dr. Wall, what was the question?
Who would be on the fire engine toy box, and who would be on the ironing board toy box?
Well, I guess a man or boy would be on the fire truck.
Yeah? Probably.
So,
I mean, I haven't looked lately, but probably, even though there are women firefighters, right? It's not a career that is marketed to parents and young girls, right, at a young age. You know, and the ironing board is probably going to have a little girl on the box, even though men wear way more clothes that need ironing than women do, right? At least in my house. I don't have anything that needs ironing. And my partner has to iron a shirt every morning to come to work. But I come dressed like this because I'm in PE. So, you know, and I'm not doing his ironing for him. So I didn't need to learn to use the ironing board. So why not put the boy on the ironing board and include a girl on the fire truck box, right? So these subliminal messages, again, it's not a deliberate, well, maybe it is on the part of the marketing people for the company who owns the toys, but you know, for parents, it's not a deliberate driving away from certain activities. It's that we're given all these messages all the time about what is appropriate for the son versus the daughter, right? So siblings, if you have siblings, would come under significant others. Often they are the first person that the child gets to play with, and if you have a brother, then, and particularly if it's an older brother, then often as a girl your participation in sport is somewhat linked to the fact that you love your brother or you admire your brother and he's going and playing, so you want to go and play with him. You know, think back to your influences when you were younger. What got you involved? Was it an older brother or sister who was playing? Was it parents who were engaged and playing? You know, think about what were the influences that led you into the path that you took that brought you to be physically active and like HPE, right? As with parents, when the child is leaving childhood, going into adolescence, certainly older adolescence, and then into adulthood, then that sibling influence is diminishing, and that doesn't tend to come back in the same way that the parental influence does. You know, once you've grown out of asking your brother and sister if you can go play with them, you know, you don't kind of go back to that. But this familial influence is linked to race and ethnicity and background. Certain geographic locations also play a role. So again, we've got this interacting set of constraints. They're not isolated and working just on their own, right? So the take-home message really is that, you know, significant others do act as a constraint on motor behavior, and their presence in your life interacts with other constraints that you are under the guise of, plus your individual constraints, right? And so we see different behaviors emerge. So think about the fact that they exist rather than worrying too much about the role that they play. Just that they exist, and therefore we saw this motor pattern emerge. Right? Then our peer group slots into that little window in the parent group. So puberty, teenage years, peers are very, very influential. Particularly as teenagers, you know, you may remember, I certainly remember some things that I did that were influenced by peers that possibly I wouldn't have done if my parents had been around. You know, and so peers provide the play group for the adolescents. They also provide a lot of emotional support if you've got very, very good friends. You know, they also play that emotional support role as well as a teenager. And they can influence what you take part in, right? So if your friends are all going to after-school soccer league, then maybe you go and try after-school soccer league, right? But if your friends all go to the computer club after school, then do you go to the computer club, or do you go on your own to soccer because you want to play soccer, right? So then you have this decision to make, and that's actually quite difficult as a teenager. Do I give up spending time with my friends and risk getting kind of isolated from the group to go and do what I want to do, or do I give up soccer and I go and do something sedentary like computer games? Right? So we find that in the research that girls' sports involvement is very influenced by their peer group if they have one, right? So if you're someone who's, you know, got a lot of friends and you're very outgoing, then we see that that group interaction can have quite a big impact. Okay? And then we have coaches and teachers. Although the research is equivocal about how strong their role is in the socialization into physical activity. Although I think that you can't overlook their influence, right? The research says that primarily they reinforce a pattern that's already been started by the family. But, you know, if you are a PE teacher or a coach, you're going to be responsible for introducing new movement patterns, right? Introducing a different game or a different skill that they've never tried with their family. So, you know, it's still a very important role, because you're going to expand that base of skills that allows them to build up into being a physically active adult, right? What we do know for sure is that teachers and coaches can have the opposite effect. They can absolutely be responsible for putting someone off moving, right? So this is called aversive socialization. And so what can happen here is that, you know, if you're in PE and you're not very good, And so the PE teacher points out to everybody in the class every week that you're the one not doing it properly, right? And so you get embarrassed, or they set up activities for PE that you fail at every week, and you're very rarely successful, right? And the emphasis is on performance rather than having fun with movement and being engaged in movement. Then that individual is likely to go, I hate PE, I'm going to quit as soon as I can, and I don't like moving. It's not fun. I'm not any good at it, right? And that would be the responsibility of that PE teacher, because they did not set up an environment that was engaging, that was promoting practice, that was promoting the idea of that mastery climate, that if you keep trying, you're going to be more successful, right? So we have this huge potential as a teacher or a coach to really detract someone's motivation from lifelong physical activity, right? Which is, of course, the exact opposite of what we're meant to be doing as coaches and teachers of movement skills. Okay, then that second box was social situations, right? And the social situations are looking at the environment, the kind of toys, the opportunity to play and socialize and practice moving. So we see that the play environment and the kinds of games that are played can also act as constraints. Right? So if I don't have enough space, then that can impact which kind of gross motor activities I take part in. Now, we're really lucky, as you've seen on the videos, at the CDC on campus, we have that huge playground. And so we don't have this situation where the children are limited to run, right? And finally, we have teachers there who are not only allowing the children to run around the playground, but actively encouraging them to run. Because what they've noticed is when their kids run a lot on the playground, they behave way better when they come back into the classroom, right? And so it's a win-win situation for the teacher. That hasn't always been the case. I've been here 15 years, and the first 7 or 8 years I was working at the CDC, the teachers spent the whole time telling the children not to run because they might fall over. So what? So what if they fall over? They're not going to break, and if they do break, it can be mended. But usually preschool kids don't break very often. Their bones are not mineralized enough, so it's quite interesting when you see them hit the floor. You'll sometimes actually see the bone flex a little bit if you're paying attention, because the bones aren't hard. So you don't see very many casts on little people. It does happen occasionally, right? Can't say never, but I've never, in all the years I've been working with toddlers and preschoolers, I have never had a kid break anything. And I do some pretty wacky stuff with the kids. So, you know, maybe I'm just lucky, but, right? So also we have to be careful that we don't gender type the play environment. So something that's quite interesting, if you drive over to Lubbock, they have some of the most amazing playgrounds around Lubbock. But what's really interesting is that they've gradually started changing the colors of these playgrounds, right? Again, playground equipment has historically been blue or red, right? And blue and red are considered gender type colors for boys. And so, again, not that it's deliberate, and not that the girl stands there and goes, oh, I'm not playing on a blue toy, right? It's not that obvious. It's way more subtle than that, okay? So we want to make sure that the play environments are gender neutral colors, so green and yellows rather than reds and blues. We want to make sure that the types of games we engage and the toys that we provide are available and emotionally kind of attractive to the girls as well as the boys, right? We don't want to discourage the girls from learning more complex movement skills, okay? Now, on a positive note, as I said, we're starting to recognize this, and playground companies are recognizing this. So if you get your hands on a playground catalog now, you'll see that there's a big move to making these playgrounds more gender neutral from a color and engagement point of view. Right. We do have certain toys, you know, I'm not a parent, but I can remember toys that I had as a child that if I had a child, I would want them to have that experience. But a lot of those toys were gender types, so then we're at risk of perpetuating the problem, right? So play with toys can act as a constraint, right? Does the toy encourage the child to be sedentary? Or does the toy encourage the child to be highly active? Also, does the toy encourage the child to be outside? Or does the toy encourage the child to be indoors? Okay? So generally, toys that are marketed to a male population are more complex. They tend to be like the balls in the boys' bedroom, right? They tend to encourage physical activity, whereas the girl gets the dollhouse. You can't really be physically active with a dollhouse, right? And so the toy can become the constraint that dictates the gender role, right? Again, it's not other than by the marketing people where it's very deliberate. But on the parents or the grandparents or the friends or the godparents or whoever is buying the toy, that person isn't deliberately going, oh, look, let's buy her a dollhouse so she's sedentary. Right? So I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's subtle, right? Subliminal here. So look at these toys, right? And think about, is the toy something you would play with mostly indoors or something you would play with mostly outdoors, right? Is it a loud toy or is it a quiet toy, right? Is that toy more likely to be for a girl or is that toy more likely to be for a boy? I'm not saying always, it's not 100%, right? We're looking at an average typical picture, not a specific family, right? So again, I think that parents are getting a little bit cuter and more aware of this marketing that they're being played with, and girls are getting more role modeling to be physically active because now we see a lot more girls' sports on TV than even 20 years ago, right? A lot more girls are on the telly now being active. And we've got more girls' sports occurring in schools. So even if the girl doesn't necessarily want to be on the team, she probably wants to support the team and her school winning, and just by going and supporting, that gives her role modeling for being active and choosing to walk rather than get in the car or something like that, right? So, we said at the beginning of this chapter that we were going to spend some time on the gender situation because it's easy to identify, right? Race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status are a little more complicated often, and it's difficult sometimes to tease out what is the individual's true preference versus what is a social cultural constraint and influence. Okay? Racial characteristics are biologically based, so they're to do with your genetics, and therefore you're genetically similar to other people within your group, right? So that becomes quite difficult to tease out from a research point of view. It's an interesting dilemma. How do I get at what's the true constraint here, right? Ethnic characteristics are culturally based, not genetically based. But if you're living within a group, then you're likely to share that culture within that group. Right? And so then we see groups showing ethnic characteristics that are also similar. SES is important because it can determine access to certain sports. So we mentioned maybe Tuesday or last week that tennis historically has been a predominantly white, upper middle class sport because they're the only people that could afford to join the tennis club that had decent courts and good teachers, good coaches to teach you how to play tennis, right? And so that's changing, certainly, right? Tennis is finally becoming more diverse, but it's taken a long, long time for that to happen, right? And sometimes we have to look at differences that we don't define as biological, right? That we don't go into the conversation or the observation saying, well, they're biologically different, ergo, this happens, right? So what the chapter is trying to suggest is that it's important that we try not to stereotype a particular group and what they can and can't do. I remember when I was an undergrad, the faculty member, faculty member, I guess you would call him, who was in charge of the program I was in, and he also taught the swimming module that we had to take. And we had one black person on the course. So that in itself says something of what it was like back then. And I remember him telling this person that they weren't going to be any good at swimming because they were black, and black people sink because their bones are so dense, or some such nonsense. And I'm thinking, that's odd. Jamaica's an island. Barbados is an island. I'm pretty sure they go in the water, right? and swim. But again, you know, swimming at that time was a predominantly white, middle class. You know, you had to pay to get into a swimming pool. And so, you know, we have to kind of start to tease out these stereotypes, these assumptions that we make about what an individual can and can't try even, right? Just try. If you don't like it, that's not the same as not having the opportunity to try it. Okay? So it's not always comfortable. This is an interesting chapter, I think, because it challenges some beliefs that we may not even realize we hold, okay? Because, again, they're subconscious, kind of learnt ideas about things. And it's not always, it's just not comfortable to examine the fact that you actually might be a racist or a fattist or an ageist or a, I don't know, right? So I think the chapter is challenging to read if you're going to read it thoroughly and with a lot of thought, because it will make you think outside the boxes that you've learned. And that's important, because if you're going to go out into the world and be a movement teacher, you have to get rid of those boxes. You have to be prepared to allow anybody the opportunity to try something. Doesn't mean that everyone is going to be great at something, right? There are a lot of other things that come into play other than opportunity to try a game or a sport that dictate whether or not you're really good at that game, at that sport. But that doesn't mean you can't have fun with it, right? You don't have to be world class to have fun with soccer. You just have to have had the opportunity to play soccer and learn some of the skills, right? So the more we're willing to kind of tease out these beliefs that we have, the better we'll be as motor development teachers, whether that's coaching, whether that's PE teaching, whether that's personal training, whether it's athletic training or PT. All those careers are motor development teachers, right? They're all teaching people how to move in one way or another. Okay? So we want to try to eliminate those distinctions that we have buried back in here and allow everybody to explore their potential at a game or an activity that they want to try. Right? And that is the end of that chapter. So, that means that on Tuesday we will be starting, let me have a look, what are we starting on Tuesday? Possibly the psychosocial self-esteem. I don't think I cut that chapter. I can't remember. Make sure that you have a look at the syllabus. Check the announcements on Blackboard. I can't remember if we're doing chapter 16 next, and I don't have a copy of the syllabus in here, it's in the office. So, stay on top of that, and I will see you on Tuesday.